Hello, today's video is on body cavities and membranes. So to this point we've talked a lot about anatomical position and anatomical regions, anatomical terms, and a lot of these terms have had to do with outside the body. So today we're going to talk a little bit deeper and talk about how we can divide the inside of the body into cavities or spaces, and what kind of membranes surround some of these organs and spaces. So we want to divide the body into spaces, and the word for that is cavities. So basically holes that organs fit into. So previously we talked about you have an axial anatomy, which is your head and thorax and your abdomen, and an appendicular, which is your arms and legs. Well, we want to go deeper than that and kind of talk about where the organs fit inside the body. And when you look at the body, the first division, you have a dorsal and ventral cavity. And so this is a great slide because it has it in two different colors. So everything that's in yellow is your dorsal cavity, and everything that's in red is your ventral cavity. And dorsal, remember, that's the back, it's like a dorsal fin. And it includes the head, where your brain is, the cranial cavity, and the vertebral cavity, which is where your spinal cord. So the dorsal cavity contains two smaller cavities. You have the large dorsal cavity, including the cranial cavity that holds your brain, and the vertebral cavity for your spinal cord. Your ventral or front cavity is basically everything else in your torso. Okay, not your arms and legs, but your torso. And it's divided into smaller cavities. There is a muscle here called the diaphragm, and it's your big breathing muscle. Everything superior or above it is called your thoracic cavity. Everything below it is called your abdominal pelvic cavity. And again, these cavities can be made into smaller and smaller cavities. Your thoracic cavity has what's called pleural cavities, which is where your lungs are. You have a pericardial cavity, peri meaning around the heart, so pericardial. You have a mediastinum, which is where your esophagus and your trachea are. Your abdominal pelvic cavity can be divided into your abdominal cavity, which is mostly your digestive system, liver, stomach, large intestine, small intestine, and your pelvic cavity, which is where your reproductive organs and your bladder are. Okay, so these are all your different cavities. You have large cavities that can be divided into smaller and smaller cavities. So again, let's look at this in a bigger view and just to look at a sagittal cut and see that you have your brain would be in your cranial cavity, your spinal cord in your vertebral cavity, both of which are in the dorsal cavity. Your thoracic cavity contains the heart and the lungs. Your diaphragm separates that from your abdominal cavity, and then your pelvic cavity is down here. Now the types of questions that you need to look for, you might say, okay, which cavity contains the heart? Well, that's a lot of cavities, because it's in the ventral cavity, yes. It's in the thoracic cavity, yes. It's in the pericardial cavity, yes. It's in all three of those cavities. So make sure you read the question. It may say, what's the smallest cavity containing the heart? That would be pericardial. What's the largest cavity containing the heart? That would be ventral. Okay, so you need to think about these cavities and what organs they contain. Just another view of the cavities. Again, if you look at the front, you can see that even though it's called the dorsal cavity, you can see the cranial cavity from the front. Okay. Here's your mediastinum, which is a small cavity inside of the thoracic cavity. It has your esophagus and your trachea. Your pleural cavities each contain a lung, so you have a left and a right pleural cavity, a pericardial cavity for your heart. Pleural, you may have heard of someone that has pleurisy, which is just an inflammation around the lung. So that would be your pleural cavity means lung. Here's your diaphragm again. Anything below this, the whole thing is called abdominal pelvic, and it's divided into abdominal and pelvic. So again, think about which organs go in that. And we're going to do some practice. I'm going to do a review video to practice your cavities for your exam. So lining these ventral body cavities, you have membranes that are called the serosa or serous membranes. And these membranes are thin, double-layered membranes, and one layer surrounds the cavity and one layer is actually lying on top of the organ. So the parietal membrane lines the cavity. Parietal means wall. And the visceral serosa or visceral membrane actually covers the actual organ. Viscera means organ, so if you eviscerate someone, you've taken out their guts. So let me just draw what it kind of looks like. So I'm going to draw a heart, and I'm going to draw the cavity that the heart's in. So there is a membrane that's on the heart itself. That's the visceral membrane. And then the membrane that lines that cavity would be the parietal membrane. And then in between these two membranes, you have a space called the space between the two membranes, and it's filled with a fluid called serosal fluid. And so this fluid allows for movement. So as the heart's beating, then the heart can beat in that space and not create friction. So your heart, your lungs, and your abdominal pelvic organs all have this double layered membrane around them. And so in the heart, in the pericardial space, you have the pericardium, and it has the visceral and parietal pericardium. And then you have the pleura space, or the pleura around the lungs. You have your visceral and parietal pleura around the lungs. And then you have around the abdominal cavity, that's called your peritoneum, and you have your peritoneal membranes. So I'm going to do each one of these on a different slide to show you how those look. So again, you have a double layered membrane that surrounds the organs in the ventral body cavity called serosa. And you have a parietal serosa that lines the cavity and a visceral serosa that actually covers the organ. Okay, so we'll go into detail next. So when you think about serous membranes, they're double-walled membranes. So imagine taking your hand and putting it inside of a balloon. So you would have a layer of balloon right on your hand, and then the outer layer, and then in between the air, that would be the serosal fluid. So this would be the visceral membrane because it's on the organ. This would be the parietal membrane because it's aligning the cavity. Okay, so now instead of my hand, let's take my heart, push it down into a double-walled balloon, and so you have a membrane. Pick another color. You have a membrane, okay, that's right on the heart. That is the visceral pericardium, okay, because that's the membrane around the heart. The membrane that lines the pericardial cavity is the parietal pericardium. And then between those two membranes is the pericardial space with the serous fluid. Okay, so that's the pericardial space. So maybe someone has pericarditis. Anytime you see the word itis, that means inflammation of, so inflammation of the pericardial membrane, so the pericardium. All right, let's look at a lung, the serous membranes of the lung. Again, let's put our hand down in a balloon. Well, if you were to take the lungs and put them down in a balloon, you get two layers again. And so the layer that's basically lining the pleural cavity is called the parietal pleura. Okay, parietal means wall. And then the membrane that is, let me write that, lost some letters, parietal pleura. And then the membrane that's shrink wrapped right onto the organ itself is the visceral pleura. Okay, so parietal pleura around the pleural cavities, visceral pleura on the actual lung. And in between that, the pleural space filled with serosal fluid. So if you have pleurisy, you have an inflammation of this membrane. Then you have membranes in the abdominal pelvic cavity. And the word we use for these cavities, or this one, is called the peritoneum. And this is one big continuous membrane. There's not one for each organ inside the abdominal cavity. It's kind of one big one that surrounds them all. And so the one that surrounds the cavity is the parietal peritoneum, and the ones that are actually on the organs is the visceral peritoneum. And then between that, you have the peritoneal space, and that's where the serosal fluid is between those two membranes. So you have visceral and parietal pericardium, you have visceral and parietal pleura, you have visceral and parietal peritoneum. All right, a few other cavities that you have, there's some smaller cavities. You have nasal cavities, which is up inside your nose. You have your mouth, which is your oral cavity. You actually have sinuses. There's actually cavities inside your skull bones, which is where your sinuses are. You have cavities for your eyes. Those are called your orbital cavities. There's a cavity inside your ear called the middle ear cavity. It's important for hearing. So there's lots of cavities. So what you need to do is practice learning your cavity names and then knowing what you would expect to find in those cavities, okay? Now, one more hint. A lot of my questions, you'll see what are called all that apply questions. So instead of just a multiple choice question, you may get an all that apply question. And so when you think about an all that apply question, you want to say what all are true. So let's think about this. Is the heart in more than one cavity? Yes, it's in the ventral cavity, the thoracic cavity, and the pericardial cavity. So which cavity, large cavity has the heart? That would be the ventral cavity. Which small cavity would be the pericardial cavity? Your all that apply question would be name all the cavities containing the heart. So if I had this as a question, I would have every cavity listed. And I would have the thoracic cavity, ventral cavity, dorsal cavity, abdominal pelvic cavity, orbital cavity, all the cavities listed. And you would mark the ones that it is in. So you would mark ventral cavity, thoracic cavity, pericardial cavity, all the ones that are true. All right? So those are what we call all that apply questions. And you'll have 2 or 3 all that apply questions on your exams. Okay? So as you learn your organs, all the ones that we cover in lab, make sure that you can tell me which cavities they're in. The largest cavity they can be found in and the smallest cavity they can be found in. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.